My name is David Botel and I'm the Associate Director for CEDA based here in Sydney. Can I start by acknowledging that we meet on Aboriginal land, the land of the Durag people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we meet on Aboriginal land, committed to recognition and reconciliation. We respect elders and support their stated aspirations. Can I acknowledge the New South Wales Minister for Jobs, Investment, Tourism and Western Sydney, whom we'll be hearing from shortly. And as the Aerotropolis will transform Western Sydney as its own global gateway, I wanted to make a special acknowledgement of leaders from across the diplomatic community and welcome consular colleagues from Canada, France, Great Britain, Germany, Korea, New Zealand and the United States. A warm welcome to you all. By way of background, this marks CEDA's 6th year of convening discussions focused on Western Sydney's continued development. CEDA cares about good public policy that deliver better outcomes, both economic and social, for the greater good. We were fortunate enough to host the premiere for the release of the New South Wales COVID recovery plan last July. And she put the Aerotropolis at the heart of the New South Wales COVID recovery, transforming Western Sydney, driving growth in new industries, sustaining business investment and generating jobs for Western Sydney. As Western Sydney becomes the national capital for advanced manufacturing and further builds credentials in our innovation systems, CEDA will continue to examine the growth that underpins this region. We'll continue to spotlight issues central to Western Sydney's social and economic development. Can I acknowledge today's sponsors, Oricon, EY and Westpac, and supporting sponsor DXC Technology. CEDA is only able to do what we do with the support of our members, and we are grateful for your support not only for today, but through our programs all year round. Thank you also to the members who have purchased a corporate table today, indicated on screen to my right and left. And a reminder to turn your mobile phones to silent, but not completely off. As always, we are tweeting from the event under the hashtag Western Sydney and Aerotropolis. You can follow along with CEDA's events and our research outputs by following us on Twitter at CEDA_news. We thank media delegates in the room and greatly appreciate their continued interest in CEDA's work. Today we'll be taking questions from our online app Pigeonhole, which you can see a URL on screen and password, and we'll be inviting responses to our poll question: what will be the most important factor in making the Aerotropolis a success? To commence today's event, I'm delighted to introduce Westpac's Alistair Welsh to make some introductory comments. Alistair will be well known to some of you, but just briefly, Alistair has more than 30 years experience in banking in the UK, New Zealand and in Australia. In December 2020, Alistair was appointed General Manager, Corporate and Institutional Banking. In this role, he has global responsibility for Westpac's corporate, institutional and government banking relationships. Welcome.
Thank you very much, David. I too would like to acknowledge the Durag people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly in Western Sydney, which, as we know, is the home to the largest urban Indigenous population. So very important that we all support and acknowledge the contribution of past, future. Minister Stuart Ayres, the Minister for Jobs, Investment, Tourism and Western Sydney, and of course the member for Penrith. I'd imagine it's been a pretty big week, for big 10 days on many levels for you and the family, but particularly obviously the floods over the last 10 days have touched everybody, in some families in a very heartfelt way, as you obviously see the challenges that people have faced in these extraordinary times. And it's wonderful to see the Minister and many of the local community out there supporting families and people in worse situations than them. And it's always very humbling to see that occur, as I know many probably in the room here have been out giving a helping hand in whatever way they can. For our part at Westpac, we've made up to 10 million contribution where we're giving a helping hand, which is also making sure that we help people with funds to get them back on track. We've made an announcement where for every consumer that is a Westpac customer, need to be clear on that, there's $3,000 and $5,000 for business customers. Now, we think that's important because getting businesses up and running is absolutely critical in the economy, and making sure that we can get people back with jobs and supporting the communities where they are. Now, today is a continuing conversation, an important conversation for Western Sydney. The boomtown, as we have fondly referred to it over the last number of years, is alive and well here in Western Sydney, and we know that the investment in infrastructure and around the Aerotropolis will be absolutely critical for the growth aspirations that rightly so this area has and should continue to have in such an important part in the economy, but most importantly for New South Wales. We are New South Wales Banker and have been for over 200 years, and we're very proud of that relationship and partnership that we have, because particularly over the last few years it's been great to see the infrastructure investment that has been absolutely critical to unlock the opportunities that we see for businesses. And I have the privilege to work around the country over a number of years in business bank, and always in New South Wales there's been a feel that we haven't had the same infrastructure and support as other states to really get business moving, and we now see that with particularly investment in infrastructure. I'd like to acknowledge the important role that CEDA contributes in bringing people together and talking about the prosperity and the growth. I'm a 28-year Westpac person, and I've been mainly in business and institutional bank, and I deeply believe that supporting the prosperity and getting businesses going and freeing them up to be more productive, to employ more people, is just so fundamental for any economy and for the lifeblood of a community, because when businesses prosper, we know that communities prosper, and I certainly deeply believe that. In terms of our view and Westpac's view, it's a pretty crazy time at the moment in many ways for us. Where we're, are we in the post-COVID period or the COVID period? It's certainly been a really challenging time. But with the vaccine program rolling out, we believe that things are heading in the right direction. We also know that the household sector is critical. Spending in the households, saving in the household sector has been strong, and the household sector will be important in making sure the economy continues to grow and bounce back. When we look at our consumer sentiment index, that's at a 10-year high, which if you'd asked me a year ago today that we were going to bounce back and have a 10-year high on consumer confidence, there's no way you would have picked that. So, people are more confident, they're wanting to look to the future, and we even see that in our GDP numbers, which Bill Evans, who is often out here and with his breakfast, is predicting a GDP to go up to 4.5%. And again, if you'd asked me a year ago if we were looking at a 4.5 GDP prediction, I'd be going, no way. So there's a lot to be positive about in my view. For Western Sydney particularly, already at the fourth biggest economy in the country, I think making a bit of a charge on Brisbane, which will please people here, but I'm sure put a few challenges to people north of the border, but rightly so. This is an important economy, and since the COVID pandemic, we've continued to see a real acceleration in investment, and the Minister's played a key role in that, because getting on and getting those projects up and running has taken longer than what we would all want. But I think that as you drive around, and I drive around with all my kids' sport, there's projects everywhere, and it's just great news for the local economy and for the economy more broadly. It was interesting to note that of the 100 fast-track programs, 45 of them are in Western Sydney. 45 of the 100, fast-track programs. So that's creating over 22,000 jobs, so very impressive again. From Westpac's point of view, we've always been a strong supporter in the local community. In fact, we have over 6,000 people in this local area as an employment, so we see this as a big employment office. And Ron Koskeri reminds me that we're moving down into Parramatta Square and taking up more space here because we see this as a great place for our people to work and our people to be in the community and prosper to help our customers be even more successful. So looking forward to today. Westpac is proud to be a sponsor of events like this which bring people together to talk about the future and talk about what's possible, and more importantly, agree to plans to commit to action is absolutely fundamental. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rowena, who will be our facilitator today. Rowena Walker, please, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Alistair, and good afternoon, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all meeting today, the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. On behalf of CEDA and the sponsors, I'd like to welcome you all today to our event on Western Sydney, What Next for the Aerotropolis. I'm looking forward to our panel discussion today, where we'll discuss the pathway of what will now be called Bradford, after the renowned engineer, to become Australia's third largest economy. We've heard it's the fourth at the moment, so it's got one place to go by 2036, and creating 200,000 jobs, attracting 12 million visitors. Oricon are proud CEDA members and are passionate about sponsoring events like this. One of our key principles is create a legacy. The Aerotropolis will certainly be a legacy, one that warrants us all coming together today as a CEDA community to discuss and determine what part we will all play in creating that legacy. Indeed, as Oricon, we're currently supporting DPI and Sydney Water in the land capability assessment and integrated water cycle management study for the Aerotropolis core and agribusiness precincts. I recently visited the Western Sydney Airport bulk earthworks site, where we're part of the design joint venture. What struck me was the immense scale of that project, and if anyone's been there, it is huge. It's bigger than you can even describe. And the other thing that also struck me was the people I spoke to, everyone in that site, whatever role they had, they were all so proud to talk about how this was the best project they'd ever been on. This was their once-in-a-lifetime project. So that's an amazing legacy to leave. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Honourable Stuart Ayres, MP, New South Wales Minister, for Jobs, Investment, Tourism and, of course, Western Sydney. If you can make your way to the stage, please, Minister.
Thank you, Rowena. It's fantastic to be here. I love being in a full room of people in a kind of post-COVID environment, although Queensland is just reminding us that we're not out of the woods yet. But a full room in Western Sydney is absolutely a fantastic sight to behold. It's also a clear demonstration of how important Western Sydney is for the economic and social prosperity of residents across New South Wales, but indeed the direction that the nation heads. In fact, if we cast our mind back to 1919, it was a year where the Royal Easter Show didn't take place, and it was the only other year outside of 2020 where the Anzac Day March didn't take place in Sydney. In fact, in that particular year, we had an Anzac Day service. It took place in Centennial Park. Veterans stood 3 feet apart, about 1.5 metres, and were all asked to wear masks. About 100 years later, the mechanisms that government have available to them, whilst they are a little bit refined, haven't actually changed substantially for dealing with pandemics. But what came after the pandemic of 1919 and 1920, as the nations around the world went through 1, 2 and 3 waves of the Spanish flu, was the Roaring Twenties. A period of time of substantial economic growth, lots of funding from governments into public infrastructure, the advancement of feminism, progressive politics, the opening up of new ideas, a resurgence of music, and a general feeling that the world was in a pretty good space. They'd come out of a war and it was time to feel good again. I think we're on the cusp of our own Roaring Twenties. We've done it tough through the course of the pandemic. Here in New South Wales, we've seen bushfires. We've come out of the back of a very significant drought across regional New South Wales. But the foundation stones for success are in the ground. There's strong governance here in New South Wales, and I think generally speaking, strong governance across the country. We are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to the global pandemic, particularly here in Australia, where we've been a best-in-class example of how to manage and deal with the pandemic. And we're also seeing a rollout of the vaccine that I hope by the end of this year we'll see international travel returning to Australia, with international visitors coming back through our global city here in Sydney. So it does present us a very unique opportunity to think about how do we continue to drive that growth? Where does Sydney and New South Wales get its next level growth? And for me, that is fundamentally Western Sydney. Places like the Westmead Health and Innovation Precinct just around the corner, where we get to blend world-class hospitals with amazing heritage precincts right on the cusp of the edge of Sydney's second most important economic centre, is truly an opportunity to behold. If you go further west to the Aerotropolis precinct, it's on a much, much larger scale. The scale of the Aerotropolis is sometimes hard for people to comprehend. The rezoning exercise that the New South Wales government took last year rezoned 11,500 hectares of land. To give you some sense of where that is, that's basically a space that runs from the GPO at Martin Place down to Kingsford Smith Airport at Mascot and out to Auburn. It's a huge, huge geographical area, and it's the single largest rezoning exercise the New South Wales government has ever undertaken in one go. And it was so critical that we undertook that because it has allowed us to step into the next phase of the way we bring that community around the airport and inside the Aerotropolis on what is going to be a substantial journey in the changes of land use across that area. It allows us to talk about what future opportunities can exist there, particularly from an economic perspective, when we think about industrial, when we think about commercial, mixed use and residential developments. It also allows us to start to articulate where local infrastructure will go. Local roads, utility corridors, riparian corridors. If we've learned anything in the last week, it's that Western Sydney is impacted by floods and will continue to be so into the future. So if we're going to outline a plan for a 22nd century city, it's critical we do so in an open and transparent fashion. And the rezoning of land in the Aerotropolis allowed us to change the value of land up front. It meant that as the government comes in to have conversations with existing landowners, and we need to put things like green corridors, community parks, local roads, utilities provisions on the ground and in the ground, we're able to compensate those local landowners at their upzoned value. This is a critical step in being able to bring the community with us. It also allows us to start to outline the plan for the Aerotropolis in a more forward fashion. But there are areas where we're going to move faster and we're going to move earlier. And so I wanted to use today's remarks to really outline the next steps around what's going to happen in and around the Aerotropolis. You've all seen the recent announcement by the government to name the core of the Aerotropolis Bradfield in recognition of JJ Bradfield's contribution to Sydney, New South Wales and indeed the country. We do want the jobs and the industries and the businesses that set up in this location to be unashamedly focused on technology, to be unashamedly focused on engineering, to be unashamedly focused on advanced manufacturing. I can't think of a better person, and quite frankly, neither could the Western Sydney community that we consulted with, who actually identified Bradfield as a name that we should be using in this precinct, to recognise the vision that we want for this area. That Bradfield city will be around 114 hectares large, and it's right in the core of the Aerotropolis precinct, just to the southeast of the Western Sydney International Nancy Bird Walton Airport. And that's the area where the New South Wales government is going to move quickly and where we're going to be the first mover. Now, this is building on an immense amount of infrastructure that's already being put in the ground around the Aerotropolis. About $20 billion worth, over $5.5 billion from the Commonwealth Government going into the Western Sydney Airport, over $11 billion going into a new north-south rail line that will connect St Mary's on the T1 Western Line through places like Orchard Hills, Luddenham, to the airport, and then around to the Aerotropolis core that we've just named Bradfield. That line forms the first stage of what will be a steel spine that will connect the outer west of Sydney, or to use terminology that we use in the New South Wales Government and is becoming, I note, more entrenched in the language of this city, which is fantastic, what we like to call the Western Parkland city, linking the northwest of Sydney through Greater Penrith, through the airport sites and down into the Macarthur, finally giving the residents of Western Sydney, that will number somewhere in the order of between 2.5 and 3 million people in the next decade, their opportunity to live, work and move around their own city. They will no longer have to undertake an economic exodus every single day to access the jobs that they want to. Transport and accessibility and mobility are absolutely crucial to the way Western Sydney evolves. On top of that on top of the rail and the airport infrastructure exists an extensive road program. And if you've travelled between Campbelltown and Penrith recently, you would notice that you're travelling over a much shorter period of time because the Northern Road upgrade has substantially changed already the flow of traffic between those two key centres. We made a very conscious decision working with the Commonwealth that we wanted not just to build an airport, but we wanted the airport to be a genuine catalyst for economic growth across Western Sydney. We started with the airport, we've built into roads, we've committed to rail, we've rezoned land, and now we're talking to individual landowners about changes through our precinct plan structure, which is really laying out that local road network and giving people the clear understanding around where land can and can't be developed. And this is about making sure that we understand the natural topography that exists in this area. I've spoken at length about floods and flood mitigation, probably a little bit more in the last week than I had done over the last 5 years. But a fundamental principle of what happens in the Parkland city is the concept of the green grid, the grey grid and the blue grid. The grey grid being the infrastructure, the road, the rail infrastructure that we all know that makes up a city. The green grid is the breathing lung of this city. We've learnt a lot of lessons since Bradfield started to lay out the electrified rail network for Sydney about how cities should be shaped and how they should be designed. And there's one thing I can tell you as a resident of Penrith, it can get bloody hot in Western Sydney. And so we need to make sure right from the very beginning that we're engineering green spaces and green corridors into that Parkland city. We don't want it to be a Parkland city in name only, we want it to be a Parkland city in practicality. We also believe that will make for a more productive workforce, more productive students, and a city that people find much more livable. So this concept of the green grid and the grey grid are fairly well known, but the blue grid is where the water goes, and running right through Western Sydney is a series of rivers and creeks, and they do change where people can and can't live, and we've got Nature's warning sign in the last week that this is a community that needs to be more flood resilient today and into the future. And so the concept of flood resilience is really built into the DNA of the Aerotropolis and the Western Parkland city. So as we step out over the next 5 years, we're going to see in 2022 enabling infrastructure making its way into that 114 hectares. That enabling infrastructure will facilitate Building 1, the very first building on Bradfield in the Aerotropolis core. As we move into 2023, we'll start construction on our advanced manufacturing research facility. the home to many of our foundation partners, and what I think will become a beachhead for many, many businesses wanting to expand into the Aerotropolis. Also in 2023, you'll see the start of construction on the new CSIRO building that will be based at the Aerotropolis. An amazing commitment by the National Science Agency to call Western Sydney home here in New South Wales, a consolidation of the CSIRO activities in Western Sydney. If there's not a more appropriate marker for putting science at the centre of this city, for putting new advancements in technology and the way technology improves citizens' lives, that translational research and applying it in a very practical way, I don't know what is more important or more marking the ground than having the CSIRO call Bradford and Western Sydney home. In 2025, you'll start to see the formation, if not the completion, of the metro station that will be at the Aerotropolis core. And in 2026, the first planes will lift off from Western Sydney International Nancy Bird Walton Airport. It's a pretty exciting runway. And when you think about the journey that I've been on over the last 10 years in Parliament, and I've watched this crowd grow from 1 or 2 tables to now a full room, that tells me that there's many other people on this journey as well. I love the fact that there's a collection of our international diplomatic corps here today. That tells me firmly that Western Sydney is not just on our radar, it's on the global radar. People engaged in international businesses are looking for where they can invest in what will be a very different world in a post-pandemic environment. My fundamental view is that the world will move into 3 distinct economic corridors: the Americas, Europe and Africa, and the Asia Pacific. And those changes will present new opportunities for New South Wales, and particularly Western Sydney, to put its hand up and say we're open for business. We've got a skilled workforce. We've got a workforce that has over 170 nations represented in it that speak over 100 different languages. Where once diversity might have been a challenge for Western Sydney, it now represents our single best opportunity. There is not a place anywhere in the country that is ready to do business with every other nation on the planet better than Western Sydney. And we're giving it its own gateway through an airport and a whole new city to capture every element of that economic advantage. If you think about some of the partners that have already come on board, our early stage partners, Hitachi, GE Additive, BAE, the National Space Agency or the Australian Space Agency, Siemens, the concept of advanced manufacturing is at the epicentre of everything that we're doing in the Aerotropolis. In fact, I'd largely argue that the concept of advanced manufacturing is almost redundant in this country now. You're either advanced manufacturing or, quite frankly, you're probably not manufacturing at all. And if you are, you're probably not manufacturing for much longer if you don't start to adopt those principles. So here I am today, talking to a full room on the cusp of what I hope is the roaring 20s. I think Western Sydney has the capacity to lead, not drag, but lead the rest of Sydney and New South Wales into this incredibly dynamic and exciting decade. And I want to leave you with a message I've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. Can I say this to you? Confidence is contagious. I'm completely over this pandemic. I love the idea that I can come and meet people in person. I love the idea that I can talk to investors from across the world. I love the idea that there are people wanting to take risks and invest in Western Sydney. Western Sydney is as confident as it's ever been. It's time to get on board. If your confidence is contagious, we can come out of this pandemic strongly. New South Wales can continue to lead the way and build on the resilience framework that we've built that allows us to meet like we're meeting today, and we can take that confidence every step of the way until the first plane takes off in 2026. Thanks very much.
I'm keen to introduce our panel of speakers. Today we have Dr. Sarah Hill, CEO of the Western Parkland City Authority. Billie Sankovic, the Chief Executive of the Western Sydney Community Forum. And the Honourable Stuart Ayres, MP, New South Wales Minister for Jobs, Investment, Tourism and Western Sydney. All right, can you hear me on the lapel mic? Okay, good stuff. Right, so one of my colleagues at Oricon reminded me the other day that the Australian and New South Wales governments were presented with a report on the joint study of aviation capacity in the Sydney region, which worked on in March 2012, which is 9 years ago. It caused me to think about, what's happened in the interim, and we talked about some of those things that are currently happening. So I guess I'd like to put to the panel, if we reconvened in 2030, post the Roaring Twenties, after another 9 years had passed, what do you hope would be the most notable differences we'd be remarking on then?
There you go.
Oh, I just spoke.
Well, Billie,
Start with Billie.
I would love to go first, actually, so thank you very much. And I'd just like to acknowledge country and that we're meeting on Darug land today, and acknowledge traditional custodians and pay respects to elders, past, present and of course future. And on that note, I would really love to answer that question first. And my answer to that is that I would absolutely like to see an extraordinary shift in population and social indicators, and especially for communities who traditionally access barriers to employment and housing, because I think that's the Aerotropolis is such an extraordinary opportunity to actually shift those population indicators, and so that all communities and all people can benefit from the confidence and the opportunity the Aerotropolis provides.
Sarah?
I'll go next, and certainly thinking to 2030 is not uncommon for me, so it's a great question, thank you. But you also picked another interesting reference point for me, which is 2012, and I was heavily involved in the early days of master planning a precinct for 2012 in East London, and we learnt a lot through that process about the importance of legacy and the importance of investment in infrastructure, but really then how you translate that into something that has a long-term benefits. And just like East London, there was a real awareness around the need to not only provide new opportunities for homes, but most critically jobs. So this is probably the single biggest shift for Western Sydney that we need to achieve. And there's no coincidence that we have a Minister for Western Sydney and investment and jobs and tourism, but also the authority, which I'm very fortunate now to be running, that looks at this concept of both investment and development coming together. So translating a vision for a Parkland city and now bringing it to life. So by 2030, our absolute ambition is building on that vision that the Minister provided, but really getting momentum and change happening, and primed by government and really the private sector then rolling with it from there and making incredible opportunities come to life for the communities that we all serve.
I want the top mark students in the best schools in Sydney to think that the best job for them is in Western Sydney. So the talent that exists anywhere in Sydney, anywhere in the country, in fact, anywhere in the world, because I think economic growth is largely going to be driven by talent. I want them thinking, as they get the top mark in the HSC, as they come out of their whatever graduation program they're in, I want them to be thinking the best job for me to advance my career is in Western Sydney.
Yeah. Western Sydney is the magnet.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Sarah, in your previous role at the GSC, you co-created the metropolis of the three cities, and then associated with that was the Future Transport 2056 strategy. Clearly, the assumptions for that strategy, have been challenged somewhat over the last year with travel patterns, the response to COVID, working from home, and obviously impacts on population. What do you think? I suppose this goes to all the panel. What do you think those changes, might be impacting the transition plan to the Aerotropolis, or if at all, or do you think that ostensibly that the end game is still there?
I think the last 12 months plus that we've been through has backed in the vision for a metropolis of 3 cities and a parkland city that redistributes that growth. And I think people will be looking for the opportunity to live in an environment that is green, that is absolutely connected to jobs and locally to jobs. And if there is something we've learnt over the last 12 months is just the importance of that 5-minute neighbourhood and that access to local services backing all of that in. But I also, believe that we've got to create this opportunity and really leverage this green concept. And as the Minister often says, we want to be internationally renowned for being a green city, and that is green in terms of parklands. You can't have a parkland city without that. But also green in terms of our economy and in the jobs and the innovation that we're driving in that space. We also need to be not only physically connected in terms of road and rail, as you referenced, but critically from a cyber security point of view, from a digital point of view, now most critical given the way we're working, those connections, but also internationally. We're now a gateway to the world, and that is increasingly being recognised as a real strength of the Western city. But also we need to be advanced in our skills and to be the most attractive location for the next generation of citizens to not only be educated but to stay in the Western city, to innovate, to research and to translate ideas into commercial outcomes. So this is a shift change, but it is also the next layer of thinking around a parkland city that we're working to develop. What's the next level of the narrative and the vision that we're trying to achieve?
And Billie, do you have anything to add to that? Are you seeing anything on the ground from your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. I think COVID has certainly brought to the fore a number of considerations in terms of people's experience in their homes, on the ground, and what we've certainly discovered is, like Sarah rightly says, connectivity and digital inclusion and exclusion as a result has certainly really been exposed as a result of COVID. So these sorts of considerations, I think, the experiences over the last 12 months or so have brought those to the fore in terms of public policy making and public debate and conversation. I think the other key point that's certainly emerged is that those people or communities who are already experiencing some level of disadvantage were the hardest hit. And the data and the evidence says that absolutely. So those conversations have been brought to the fore as well, and how policy making and considerations, particularly in a context of growth and extraordinary outcomes in terms of our economic activity and our economic outcomes. So those considerations have come to the fore in terms of decision making and discussion, and how can we have that in a nation that's prosperous.
Anything to add, Minister?
I think there's a real opportunity for us to recognise how important being global is. This idea of isolation actually being better. I think we're all learning that it's not. We like to have interactions with people. We like to have access to skilled workers. We like international students being in our cities and in our communities, and that this idea, we almost kind of started to delude ourselves. Perhaps the concept of protecting ourselves was better off than actually engaging, and now we've not been able to engage. We've really learned how important that international engagement is, and so as we come off the back of this experience, I hope that we go forward in a way where we really think about how our place in the world and our interactions around the world can add a lot of value to our communities. And when you think about social service work, supporting people with a disability, if you've gone through a flat period of migration, almost certainly there'll be an uptick in the age of the population. Migration keeps our age younger, so you're going to have at least a small uptick in that. That's going to create a lot of employment opportunities for people around the globe to work in Australia and bring their skills and almost double down on that diversity opportunity.
All right. So Just Billie, picking up on some of your comments around the community. So obviously, as you said, with huge investment in infrastructure and major developments around the Aerotropolis, encouraging that population growth, what pressures does this place on, social service delivery amidst Western Sydney's unprecedented level of development? What priorities do you think there is to foster that level of social inclusion and community health and wellbeing?
Yes, so there's no doubt the Aerotropolis really provides an extraordinary once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So when we look at I think broadly how that might be able to facilitate people's access to employment, housing, transport, just general improvements to health and wellbeing across the area. We really need to be thinking about where we are still lagging and where we in the past, sure, it's a smaller scale level of development, but nevertheless there are areas where there are gaps. So we completed a piece of work sort of about 18 or so months ago, and we actually explored the level of investment per capita in supporting communities outside of government investment, and it was specifically exploring how do we support your parents, or how do we support your children, or how do we support your neighbours or yourself, across employment, across health, across all those things that you live every single day and your families live every single day. And what we discovered, and we only did this in Western Sydney at an LGA level, is that there is gross inequities in terms of levels of investment per capita. So we have some areas where it's around that sort of $50 to $60 mark per capita investment, and in other areas there was 800. So it's gross inequities. So what it means is where you live matters. How well you and your children and your families and your parents and your neighbours do, and how well you can access fundamentals matters. So we haven't actually explored that work beyond Western Sydney. We've focused on the 13 LGAs of Western Sydney. We are looking at a comparative piece between Western Sydney and the rest of Sydney, but I'm a bit scared to do that because I might find even more gross inequities. So when we've got this Aerotropolis, we've got this extraordinary opportunity to actually look at that, to look at universal access for everybody, and particularly for those experiencing, some barriers. I want to just talk about one point in relation to that, like employment, for example, and access to jobs. We have, if I can draw on Professor O'Neill's work in employment from the Centre of Western Sydney through Western Sydney University, Professor O'Neill, the work highlighted two areas, and those two areas were the lack of professional and knowledge jobs in Western Sydney. And we all know that, we all live that, we all experience that. And when you look at the precinct planning for the Aerotropolis, it's really promising. I mean, it's really exciting from my perspective to think that all of a sudden, there's 2,000 jobs target, there's I won't say advanced manufacturing minister, but manufacturing, and the science park, the agribusiness precinct. I mean, these are extraordinary opportunities, and you can see the direct link between strategy and outcome in that highlight. But the other piece of work that was highlighted by Professor O'Neill relates to entry-level jobs, particularly for those who might be experiencing entrenched and generational, indeed, disadvantage, the young people, older workers, migrants. I mean, we know that they're underemployed. And we've got a couple of strategies there in terms of the Aerotropolis, social procurement, fabulous, entry-level jobs around the core, the Aerotropolis core. So really promising stuff, and I'd just like to see in terms of the next steps for us to be a bit more sophisticated about that and think about other strategies so we can address some of those inequities.
So Minister, are you keen to obviously to see those inequities that Billie's just described, being ironed out and
I think there's two
rebalanced?
things. I don't want to take away from the eastern part of the city and reallocate it to the western part of the city. I want the east to grow and I want the west to grow faster. So you have a more balanced city. It's a pretty simple principle. And the other thing that you need to do, I fundamentally believe that you can engineer in solutions from the beginning. So the idea about creating spaces that are more diversified in their housing mix, we change the activity that happens at the street level, we integrate green corridors, we think about the provision of multi-utilities in the growth corridors of Western Sydney, so that more of those riparian corridors can be used for other uses rather than giant sets of power poles. Those types of things, I think, are really critical to allowing the diversity of jobs. The one thing I don't want Bradfield and the Aerotropolis core to be is another business park that kind of operates from 8 a.m. to 4:30 or 5:30, and then it has nothing in it. This has got to be a dynamic 24-hour economy, and for that to happen, there's got to be a diversity of people, a diversity of housing types, a diversity of employment, and we're trying to engineer that in from the beginning.
I'll just move on to, we talked a fair bit about jobs, obviously with the promise of and the ambitious jobs targets, and I know, Minister, you quoted some numbers there across those industries. How confident are you that these projections will hold and be felt across the community? You just talked to there, and can you talk a bit more about the plans around upskilling, retooling and training? I don't know whether Sarah, who wants to go first on this one?
Yeah, okay, sure. Well, a couple of important things. When we listen to the community in Western Sydney, they have great ambitions for the types of jobs that they want to work in, the types of companies that they want to work in. Major international firms that they aspire to work for, being located in the Western City is absolutely key. And when I listen to young women in the Western City, they talk about how important it is that the jobs are local, so that their families feel confident that they're able to not only travel to work but get home at night, and there is a security and safety element to that as well. But then I also listened to our foundation partners, one of which, DB Schenker, quite frankly said, hey Sarah, most people don't grow up wanting to be a freight forwarder, and we find it hard to get people with the right skills. So we need to start to match all of this together with the incredible interest and the incredible commitments we're now getting from international firms, and indeed wonderful local firms that are growing and gaining in a global presence. We need to now match up this incredible growth from a citizen point of view, population growth we're getting in the Western City, and we're rich with opportunity there, with these great companies. And so in doing this, we think we need to be more than an organisation that just attracts businesses or drives local business, but one that creates an education program that's fit for purpose for them. And so I shout out to a number of our foundation partners who are here, the universities and TAFE, but also critically businesses who are co-designing with us a series of short courses or micro-credentials as they're known, to really bridge that gap between the two. And we think this is an absolute game changer for Bradfield, because you're starting to tie together and connect place, investment and education. And this very powerful package is really not only great for the citizens of the Parkland City, but incredibly attractive from an investment point of view. So this is the real game changer for us that we're bringing together. And like all things, moving a million miles an hour, because there is a window of time at the moment that we've got to run through and grab the opportunity.
I think there's genuinely global lessons to be learned here. A lot of our early stage thinking around advanced manufacturing research facility as sort of the first sort of holding beachhead comes from Sheffield in the north of England at the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, and the big investment that came from the UK government and the EU into that space, or into that geographical location, which was really about a structural adjustment in the economy that had seen jobs that existed in old industries go away, and how was the government going to support investment in new industries to help reskill members of the community. So there's kind of a lesson that's learnt there. I'm a big fan of the integration of industry and vocational training much closer together, more like the German model, to use that turn of phrase, where you actually bring the sort of the chambers of commerce, the actual industry players, almost into the education system, I think there's a big step in that direction through our recently announced Institute of Applied Technology to sit alongside and work with our TAFE institutes to make sure that we're offering flexible courses that industry can shape for the skills that they need. I mentioned before that we're going to be in a contest for global talent. We can also create that talent here ourselves with the way we shape that. And then I think about even sort of the opportunities that come out of the integration of technology into platforms like space and defence, where the Commonwealth Government is investing substantially in a renewal of the Australian Defence Force. I'm not that interested in, welding parts of the submarine together. That can happen in South Australia. I'm not really concerned about that. But what I am really focused on is the sonar system that's made by a French firm, or the periscope that's made by the French firm, that requires highly specialised skills that New South Wales is much more inclined to do. That's the stuff that I want to do at Aerotropolis. I don't need a big shipyard with the welder welding the big components of the steel together. There's plenty of natural advantages that exist across the country for us to undertake this national endeavour, but we've got those specialised high, at the end of the value chain, skill sets that allow us to play in that advanced manufacturing space, and that's how you can leverage some of those national expenditure items to really grow a skill base here, and that can then be converted into export opportunities, not just tailoring to a domestic market.
So that obviously we're talking about homegrown talent. I guess some of the highly specialised skills we may need to get from overseas and to help with the training as well. CEDA released a report, I think, early yesterday on just that might be looking at sort of a mismatch in some of the skill migration areas. Is there anything that you can see that we could do better as a nation to address that, to unblock anything that might help the Western Sydney skills advancement?
The moment the restrictions that cap my hotel quarantine program to 3,000 arrivals a week are removed, we should take an ultra-aggressive position on skilled migration. There's no doubt our education system will take time to build up to the capacity that we need to sustain the high wage economy that we have and we want to continue to have. We shouldn't delude ourselves. If we don't have those skills available to us now, we should just go and import the most talented people, bring them in, grow our businesses and use those people to shape our education system. And that doesn't have to just be in advanced manufacturing and technology. If we need high quality chefs, because high quality chefs make for great entertainment and great restaurants, and that's what people who are talented around the world want to have access to, then we need to put a chef alongside an engineer, because they're just as important to our economy, particularly when it comes to the point where we're trying to attract the best people around the world to come and work here.
Absolutely, chefs and engineers. I'm an engineer. Alongside a chef. All right, so we've heard about a bit about the investment strategy, and Sarah, you mentioned the private sector investment, in particular the foundation partners. Could you tell us a bit more about that? And I guess a bit of a call to arms to this room. What further investment from industry are you looking, and support from private sector to make this a success?
Yeah, there's a lot within this, and I'll start by saying I've inherited 18 wonderful foundation partners thanks to the Minister and my predecessor, which really created a strong foundation for us to build a series of ideas around the new approach education and training, but also to design an area that's purpose-built for business. And, as a city planner and someone who's been in the property sector for over 20 years, housing's relatively easy compared to jobs. I mean, nothing's overly easy, but jobs are hard, and really designing a precinct, not just for the next generation, but for the 22nd century city, as the Minister said, is really requires people at the forefront of business and the forefront of innovation and ideas. So unashamedly, we are saying to our foundation partners and indeed our subsequent city partners, so we now have another 6 MOUs off the back of that look at the city as a whole. We are saying really challenge us here, really give us the ideas. How can we not only design an investment package in education, but actually create a city that's fit for purpose. So that's my call to you here in this room from an ideas point of view, from a delivery point of view. As the Minister referenced, we're looking at a series of incredible innovations that you can only do in a greenfield area around multi-utility approaches. For all those multi-utility junkies out there, of which I've found out there are many. People love utilities, they love tunnels. We've got Guy here, who's definitely a convert. These are opportunities for us to not only innovate, but also go to the market for investment for. And certainly our intention is that we kickstart change, but we want to work with the private sector to deliver it. That's the only way to go, certainly at the scale we're talking about. So 11,000 hectares, for an Aerotropolis, 100,000 for our city, and 72 kilometres at the moment is ready to go from a development point of view. So extraordinary numbers that you've probably never ever seen anywhere in the world and will again. So the opportunity's there. We can't do it alone, that's for sure.
Yeah. And so, Billie, from a community point of view, you seeing that level of excitement? Are you sort of seeing any preferences for who they want to see be on their doorstep and work with?
Look, I think from certainly the people that I've been speaking to, I think there's certainly a level of excitement about what opportunities the Aerotropolis is presenting, be that local communities or be that the multi-billion-dollar industry, human services and health industry in non-government industry in and across Western Sydney. And look, I don't know that there's any preference specifically in terms of who to work with, but there certainly is an extraordinary level of excitement and about the opportunity, and more so about how the three sectors of government, community and business can work together in terms of shaping and improving the health and wellbeing outcomes of people that live in Western Sydney and beyond.
I just want to make one other quick observation. A lot of what we're talking about is, we say nation building, city shaping. This is the practical example of that, but it takes time. Mm-hmm. Like it actually takes a lot of time to work through planning processes, talk to hundreds and thousands of local landowners, run budgets for multi-billion-dollar projects. People front up to their board. I have to front up to a cabinet and take a proposal for a multi-billion-dollar rail line or a multi-billion-dollar. These are massive submissions. They take a huge amount of effort, and the delivery time is over a period of time where 5 and 10 years looks like a relatively short runway. I think it's really critical that we don't underestimate how important the visitor and hospitality economies will be as early movers. An airport is still an airport. It's a gateway. It allows more people to come into a location. The Blue Mountains, literally right next door to the airport, is outside of Sydney CBD, the single most visited location in the Greater Sydney Basin. Over 4 million visitors a year. Tourism and hospitality disproportionately employ women. They have done consistently for a long period of time, and I think will continue to do so. So I think there's really some great and interesting opportunities around not just thinking about the big pieces of kit and the kind of structural shifts in the economy. A consistent piece or part of the economy that's going to be there and can continue to grow is this visitor economy piece. And I think whilst the flip side is true at the moment, COVID has disproportionately impacted those sectors and therefore disproportionately impacted women who work in those sectors. The growth opportunity that comes on the flip side of this, I think that's a really critical near-term win that we can really, really focus on.
All right. I'm just going to move to sustainability. So obviously transition risk is a key factor for some key sectors, including agriculture, of which we've got that is a key element to the Aerotropolis. So how is the Aerotropolis looking to take the lead in sustainable industries, and how have the new precincts factored in the concept and reality of, say, a circular economy?
Yeah, all fantastic questions, and fortunately we're just about to kick off with a new team member who's going to lead on environment and circular economy. So really key areas that we need to drive forward, because we know our western city is hot. We know normally we get half as much rain as the eastern city, although they're slightly different in the last week. But we certainly also know we need to work within a landscape that is World Heritage, but also, you know, critically sensitive to outcomes, and a landscape that has largely been agricultural and privately owned for the last couple of 100 years. So there's some big changes that we need to make to bring this back into public ownership, but also to manage our city within a landscape. And building the city of the size that we do, we need to respect it in a landscape. Our ambition is to make the most green city and one that is livable, because if we want to attract global talent, it's got to be incredibly livable and attractive. We have river beaches, we have close access to surf beaches if you're in the southern parts, and we have incredible agricultural opportunities with a green belt around our western Parkland city. So we really need to leverage that, and again, we're setting up some incredible groups of experts to help us do that. Everything from building materials to circular economy, to evapotranspiration, to tree canopy cover. All of this has to come together in a cohesive and consistent approach for the Parkland city. So much to do there from a design policy point of view, but also some long-standing issues about how we manage water, and certainly how we design our buildings that don't have dark roofs, but indeed have appropriate materials for a western city. And then innovations around shade canyons in our new city centres, so you can walk around in a cool way around to your local bar or cafe. Down the road from CSIRO, so we're working on all of these elements coming together. But it's a key component.
Creating that vision.
Absolutely.
I can see it now. Feel it.
I reckon ag's a really good bet. I look north and see India, over 1 billion people. I look at China, I see over 1 billion people. I see the rest of Asia wedged between China and India, and I see almost emerging 1 billion people. And then I look at the Netherlands, a postage stamp style or size of a country, and it exports more food than Australia does. That is just I won't call it an indictment, it's a huge opportunity, right? The Netherlands cannot export more food than Australia. Now, water is a big part of this, but we almost need to take a Netherlands-style approach to the concept of intensive agriculture. If you can shorten supply chains between regional New South Wales and agri precinct that's located right alongside a airport and freight and logistics terminals, things like cold storage transportation allows us to literally go from the paddock to the plate in under 36 hours. That's a huge shift in thinking that's available to us. I think there'll always be a need for broad acre cropping and large acreage farming, but I think we could massively improve our outputs by investing significantly into intensive agriculture. I love the sort of full circle of life of this part of Western Sydney being small market farms that serviced and was the food bowl for an emerging colonial city that was stuck on the other side of the world, and that over time that turning itself into an intensive agricultural hub that doesn't service a colonial outpost, that services the largest human population growth corridor in the history of humankind. Like that opportunity is huge.
If I can add to that point of sustainability and planning, and it's great to hear some of the vision around the Aerotropolis precincts. I think when we talk about Western Sydney being hot, and if you live in Western Sydney, you know exactly what we're talking about, but we also need to consider that in context, meaning that the urban heat belt is and has increased as a result of the way that we've developed Western Sydney, not only in the last 2 or 3 decades, but in the last sort of 5 years even. So if you drive around Western Sydney in the southwest corridor or the northwest corridor, you'll see that for yourself. So whilst Western Sydney is, yes, hot, it's getting hotter, and we know that, and that is because our grey spaces are just not absorbing, and I'm a social worker, I'm not an environmentalist, so I don't know, but I do read, and but the reality is that the grey space is not absorbing the heat. And in terms of our planning, we have situations where, for example, we're perpetuating and exacerbating that, in that, for example, Leppington Station, locals are screaming for the car park, right, at Leppington Station, because you have to park like literally 5 kilometres away. So it takes you an hour to get on the train, let alone then to get further. So of course, there has to be a political and a policy response to that. But it's impossible to get there by bus. So everyone is forced to drive there, which then creates the need for additional grey spaces, which then contributes to the urban heat belt. So I think in terms of the Aerotropolis, there's some of the things, obviously early, this is an opportunity for us to think about those things early on in the piece, but also think about how that's impacting existing development over the last 10 to 20 years.
I think that's an absolutely critical point of changing the nexus there between more development and having more concrete. And I think there's a real opportunity in the plans that are now being produced where you have a real different approach to a typology and an outcome, but also critically stopping people having to drive to a car parking, to a rail station and having to travel to work. So big shifts in that regard and big ambitions for the city.
All right, I might just close out the panel discussion with one sort of final question for each of you to answer. And I guess in my introduction talked about creating a legacy. So I'd like you to personalise this, and each of you are connected to Western Sydney in a very different way. How would you summarise the legacy that you'll leave in Western Sydney? Who wants to start?
Great. I don't have time to think about my answer. Look, I grew up in Cabramatta under the times of Whitlam in the 70s, and I'm still live in Western Sydney. So when I think about my legacy, I think about that as a human being, and as a woman, as a mother, as a partner, and a resident of Western Sydney, not necessarily within the context of Billie, who works for the Social Development Council. So, the legacy I'd like to leave is really being able to contribute to the hows, and the hows are the planning instruments, the infrastructure delivery, the business investment, the economic activity in a way that really shapes and improves the outcomes for all communities, including the diverse and rich communities of Western Sydney who have their different experiences.
Sarah?
Yeah, well, so personalising this, I'm very proud to say my 9-year-old son won the Respect Award yesterday for a number of things at his school, but one of which is he had to draw a picture of someone he respected, and God love him, but he drew a picture of me, so I'm not sure what he was after. He Googled the Treasury website and got a photo of me, and but he wrote this wonderful blurb about it for the Young Archie competition, and it was along the lines of what I do for work, and really, very excited about the fact we could be building a space factory and all sorts of things like that, as a 9-year-old boy would be, but very proud about the work that we were doing and the opportunity to change things. So I think for me personally, I think in 20, 30, 40-year time frames, and we're on an incredible journey here. My legacy would be stopping the talking and actually getting on with the doing. I've been working in the Western City for the last 20 years, tracking jobs, tracking the declining ratio of jobs to residents, and turning that around and stop talking about it, writing about it, but actually making stuff happen is the greatest legacy that I could contribute to.
I remember driving down Henry Street, Penrith, on the day after I'd just won the Penrith by-election in 2010. and I drove past the tax office building on Henry Street in Penrith. If people who know Penrith, it's the tallest building.
Yeah.
I remember watching that building getting built at school, and then no other tall buildings came after it. And I said to Maurice as I was driving down the street, we were going to meet Barry O'Farrell for a press conference, and I was still trying to digest what had just happened because I really thought I was going back to work on Monday to do the job that I was doing beforehand. And I said to her, well, now that we've got this opportunity, I'm going to make this place look different. That building should have been the genesis of a catalytic investment across all parts of Western Sydney, and it just didn't go anywhere for 10 years. So I made a personal commitment to myself that day that at the end of my time, Western Sydney would just look different. It would have different buildings in it, it would have an airport, more people would want to live there, and that's really what I think my legacy is, and that's what I've committed to ever since I started this job 10 years ago.
Thank you. We look forward to that different skyscape. All right, so we're going to move tack now and turn to the audience questions. We got a few through already on Pigeonhole, so thank you for those, and I encourage some more of you to get. Have we got the Pigeonhole details up there? So if you could use the app, and we can, and if you could, I've got quite a few anonymous ones here, so if you want to declare who you are, that's fine. I think David Stuart Watt is the only one that's declared himself, so thank you, David. I'll start with the first one, and I might direct this at the Minister. Why should taxpayers pay for infrastructure and compensate land owners at upzoned value? Why did the government not use a land value capture mechanism and powers it has available?
I think because it's fair. This is about maintaining fairness. So if we're going to use land for a public purpose, a local road, a utility corridor, a local park, then it's fair that we acquire that land from those landowners at the upzoned rate that they would have been able to develop that at. It would be, I think, incredibly unfair if we decided that we were going to go and lay out the road network, lay out where the parks were, lay out where all the public purpose was across that 11,000 hectares, buy it at rural zone rates, and then turn up a week later and say, hey, by the way, everything else has just been rezoned to enterprise and you can go and rip in and make as much money as you like on the way through. Does it cost the taxpayer a little bit more money? Yes, but it maintains a degree of fairness. And fundamentally, if you're going to build an entirely new city and change the shape of a community, you have to embed fairness in at the beginning.
And if I can back that in, certainly the investment we're making and the analysis we're doing shows that the investment in the infrastructure is going to have an economic benefit for all of Western Sydney, and indeed on the back of Western Sydney and the investment that will be made there will be driving the economic recovery of the country. So this benefits everyone, and the ratios are pretty phenomenal. We're not talking 1 for 1. We're talking, we're talking 3 to 1 in terms of the return. So this is a change for everyone.
Okay. So we talked about the upskilling the existing workforce, existing population, and then the balance with skilled migration. So the question here is, how will upskilling of existing talent be encouraged rather than just relying on importing skilled migration?
Oh, well, we touched on this in our remarks already, but I think the NETM model, leveraging out of the new training and education model, with a focus on bringing industry and education providers much closer together. One of our foundation partners at the Aerotropolis is the New Alliance, which is made up of 4 universities: Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong, Uni of New South Wales, Western Sydney. The UTS is already engaged there. We've announced that the Institute of Advanced Technology, which is a new approach to vocational training, is going to be based at Kingswood as its first one of its first pilot sites. We know we've got to disrupt what's happened in our vocational training space to make it more relevant to industry. We know that it's got to become more nimble and more agile, and that's where we're really we often say we're the sandpit, we're the test bed for these types of this type of thinking, and that's really what we're going to continue to do. I don't confess that we've got every answer perfect here. I don't think that we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to the Aerotropolis. I'm happy to make mistakes. I'm happy to fail a few times. I'm going to try and minimise those, but I really want to test ideas as much as we possibly can.
That sounds good.
If I can just add
if I was
to that.
worried about failure, I wouldn't have done any of this stuff.
Billie.
To that point as well, we have, and I haven't had a chance to read the CEDA report, but I know I'm looking forward to having a look at that. But we know in Western Sydney, due to the diverse, the sort of rich diversity, we have an extraordinary level of skill that we haven't tapped into in terms of local communities. And certainly from the work that we've done and with the agencies that work directly with migrants, be they humanitarian or otherwise, or skilled migrants, I mean, there's challenges that are experienced by these families where the focus has to be on getting a house and feeding their family and sending their kids to school. So if all they can get is an entry-level job driving a cab, that's what it is until they get their qualifications sorted out and then get linked to industry, and they just don't get time to be able to do that. So there are some real practical barriers and ways that we haven't, but we could tap into this extraordinary talent that we have in Western Sydney.
And I suppose building on that, the next question was, how do we ensure that those existing people in Western Sydney, share in that growth and not, and the question here is not squeezed out in that sense. How do we, are there going to be mechanisms by which, we sort of prioritise local workforce to make sure that they are seeing that the outcome?
Well, I think we're already doing that in a lot of the procurement contracting activity that happens now from a government perspective. Whenever I'm on a construction site in Western Sydney, I'm always meeting people who, I think you mentioned in your opening remarks kind of the pride of being in the kind of once in a lifetime project. The other thing I hear quite regularly is how good is it to work close to home? And so I think businesses are looking and seeking out small businesses, contractors that are embedded in those local communities. We've got Indigenous procurement policies which are being utilised on road infrastructure projects. The airport's got a wonderful Indigenous procurement program that's well above trend. So I think there are some really good examples of where procurement policy is really opening the door to those types of initiatives.
And I think it's fascinating, we're now worrying about people coming from the eastern city to the western city for work. So we have certainly changed the dial on things in the last few years.
Bring it on.
Yeah, certainly the Minister and I talk about, the need for the rising tide to lift all boats in this part of our city. And indeed, rather than is often the case in areas that, experience urban renewal where a new population will come in and push the existing out, our strength in the western city is the existing population. And I think we're pushing on an open door when we're wondering whether they're going to be keen to be involved in these programs and education opportunities. People I'm talking to are really excited about it. But critically also, the businesses are coming to Western Sydney because of those skills and of that population growth. So it's our biggest asset as comparative to other parts of Australia. So I think we've just got to keep promoting that, and it's a great problem to have.
Okay. So this one's from David Stuart Watt. Thank you for volunteering your name around transport. Can you explain the priority for extending the heavy rail line from Leppington into the Aerotropolis to enable the direct connection to and from other key areas of Sydney?
Yeah, so stage one of the Western Sydney, or the outer Western Sydney rail line, St Mary's to the Aerotropolis. The other stages of that rail line will be St Mary's to Tullawong in the north, from Aerotropolis to Macarthur in the south, and from Aerotropolis to Leppington. The order in which we'll do those, we'll discuss, I think, internal of government. We'll go through our own assessment process. I think the sheer proximity of connecting to the Leppington line makes it an obvious next step. What I won't necessarily agree with the question is whether you would extend heavy rail or whether you would actually extend metro and integrate metro across that corridor. So I think that's a discussion that we'll look to see the pros and cons on both sides. But I called it a steel spine in my remarks. I think it connects the northwest with the southwest, and you know, it was a brave decision by government to go for the kind of that decision to go St Mary's to Aerotropolis. It would have been really easy just to kind of extend the heavy rail line, and that could have been the last heavy rail line that we ever built in Sydney, because we'll probably just build metro, and just say, yeah, hey, look, we got a connection to the airport. We did it really quick. We did it on the cheap. And then, you know, government changes into the future, and all of a sudden that $20 billion rail line looks too expensive and Western Sydney gets shafted again. We took a ballsy decision to really put that marker in the ground that says, here's what the long-term plan is going to be. And I think putting that St Mary's to Aerotropolis rail line in place, it connects it to the T1 Western line, so it's the arterial spine of the entire rail network anyhow, so we get greater connectivity out of that. But it really locks in future governments to make those connection opportunities to the rest of the rail network.
All right, so something else, another question around transport, but this time active transport. The question from Rachel Fowler, how can we influence the development of the Bradford Parkland City to support active transport and promote healthy lifestyles?
I think I'll go back again to a comment from the Minister earlier about, you know, parts of our city benefit from walking out of your home office, if you're lucky to have that, or your dining table where you've been working during COVID, down to a local cafe, you grab a coffee and you're able to walk there. The Western City doesn't always benefit from that, and so we need to change the typology of how we're building our city so it can be more active, more walkable. You can walk down a street, you've got the shade of the tree or shaded canyon, as I referred to earlier. And so Bradfield has to be an area that benefits from active transport, and I would expect that the workers and residents of it would expect nothing less as well. It will be serviced by public transport. We already know that that's a game changer in terms of contribution to health, but also we'll be designing an intricate road network and pedestrian network that allows us to achieve that. But we've also got to design places where people want to go to and walk to. So there will be public parks, billabongs, retail and recreational areas that'll make it attractive and safe. Because that is a key issue in terms of building our cities as well, that we need to create safe, secure and desirable locations to be. So bring on your ideas on how we're going to do it, but we're certainly thinking and working very hard to achieve those outcomes.
Certainly active, if I can add, active transport's critical, and I think that the way that the Aerotropolis precinct has been planned absolutely factors that in from the outset. But it's just not a reality though in Western Sydney. We just don't see the level of delivery and access to active transport options at you know, in any of our developments. So again, it's a lesson learned for the planning of the Aerotropolis, and what next is that how do we actually bring that to life, and how do we not increase social polarisation where we sort of have the haves and the have-nots. So, yeah. So I sometimes think of moving out. I'm thinking
I think active transport has two fundamental challenges in Western Sydney. Don't make the mistakes of the past where we designed suburbs and communities without active transport. So learn that lesson, engineer those solutions up front in new greenfield sites like the Aerotropolis, and then aggressively invest in active transport to retrofit existing communities, because active transport has a big economic and investment attraction element to it as well. If people are more mobile, if they're able to move to more places more rapidly, they're more active participants in trade and commerce. I can think of, we built a massive pedestrian bridge over the Nepean River at Penrith. Got pilloried by half the community whilst we built it. The other half loved it. It's a classic infrastructure project. And then, you know, now it's open. Everyone loves it. But the thing that I love most about this is that bridge has like tenfold increased the pedestrian activity around the Nepean River precinct. And what comes off the back of that? Over $60 million worth of investment is now on the ground into new hotel, new restaurants, an outdoor sort of farm cafe. It's called the Orchard. That's a substantial investment in its own right. All of those things come off the back of an active transport investment, and that can be replicated in lots of other parts of Sydney.
It is a phenomenal case study, and just a case in point, the number of people on the weekends that are using it along the Great River Walk is extraordinary.
All right, well, I'll wrap the Q&A there. We still had lots of questions, and I'm sure people around the room are keen to chat to you. So I'll just finish off with the poll question, the outcome of the poll question, which was, what will be the most important factor in making the Aerotropolis a success? So the 20% was the Western Sydney Airport Metro line, as was the ability to generate jobs and boost economic activity. But out in the lead at 60% was developing the Aerotropolis as a self-sufficient third city. So there you go.
Couldn't agree more.
We're on to it.
I'd finally just like to introduce Jason Wrigley, if he could come up to the lectern, please. Jason is the Managing Partner of Western Sydney at EY, and if he'd like to give us a vote of thanks, please.
Thank you, Rowena. Good afternoon, everybody. And on behalf of EY, I'd like to thank everyone for joining this important dialogue and for openly engaging in a great discussion today. I hope you all found this event as informative and as enjoyable as I did. On behalf of everyone here, I'd like to personally thank the Honourable Stuart Ayres, Dr. Sarah Hill and Billie Sankovic for joining today's event and for being so open with the discussions that have taken place today. It was a pleasure to hear from you all, and I look forward to seeing your continued support for Western Sydney. As a long-term resident of Western Sydney, I was schooled in Penrith and I live in Glenbrook in the Blue Mountains. And Minister, to your point around that Australian Tax Office building in Henry Street in Penrith, I'm not sure what inspired me to be an EY tax partner, but it certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't that building. You're right. I can say without hesitation that these are the most exciting times for the region, and my thoughts and sentiments have been reinforced through the discussions today. So thank you. It's also encouraging to hear that the needs for jobs in Western Sydney and the Aerotropolis in particular remain at the forefront. I refer to recent forecasts which predict that 2/3 of Sydney's population growth will be absorbed in Western Sydney, but only currently 1/3 of Sydney's jobs are located in the region. It highlights a real disconnect between population growth and jobs growth in the area, and the Aerotropolis will be critical, I think, to rebalancing the equation. The panel discussion and comments from Mr Ayres in particular reinforce that the government continues its support for the growth of Western Sydney by directing funds to the area and devoting a large amount of effort into helping build the Aerotropolis. These commitments are a good sign for businesses, for industry and for investors, and it reassures us all that government is taking development and growth of Western Sydney seriously, and businesses in Sydney should be doing the same thing. It's great to hear all the stories of international investment, and absolutely we at EY encourage that. I'd also personally like to see a growth in domestic investment in the Aerotropolis. The region, I think domestic investment is very important for the long-term success for the region, and I think that our domestic economy in particular is in prime condition to take advantage of it. As you said, Minister, confidence is contagious, and I think as we've seen recently through the economic, health and political institutions coming together with fighting the pandemic, our response has been one of the best in the world, if not the best. It means that while there might still be challenges to be solved, relatively speaking, we're in a great position to recover quickly and outperform our global peers, not just in the short term, but in years to come. This should give the private sector, it should absolutely give the private sector the confidence to take the opportunity, invest now, and help create more of the jobs we know we're going to need in Western Sydney. At EY, we are focused on building a better working world, particularly here in Western Sydney, where we've been long-term advisors on matters regarding infrastructure, transport, housing, and particularly health and education. We look forward to being part of the bright future ahead for the region and the Aerotropolis in particular. And finally, a big thank you to our host, CEDA, for facilitating this event and bringing together the Western community to hear from these stakeholders who are having a great impact on the future of the region. I look forward to more of these opportunities to gather throughout the year. Thank you, CEDA. David, I'll hand over to you for closing remarks.
Thanks, Jason. And on behalf of CEDA, I'd like to echo those words of thanks both to today's speakers and also, of course, our sponsors, Oricon, Westpac, EY and DXC Technology. Skills came up today in today's discussion at length, and a couple of remarks that stood out for me. Billie mentioned that we need to ensure that no groups are disadvantaged in our ongoing development. Sarah talked about making sure there was a greater skills matching system between employees and employers. This touches on CEDA's latest research report, which was referenced and released yesterday, optimising Australia's permanent skilled migration system. We examined data from the Department of Home Affairs and found that 1 in 4 skilled migrants are currently working beneath their qualification, which equals costs $1.25 billion in foregone wages since 2013. So we made a series of pragmatic recommendations within that report to address that issue, and that report is currently available on our website, and I encourage you all to follow up with that report and circulate it amongst your colleagues. Our communities are only as strong as the people within them, and they are only as strong as if we give them the opportunity to reach their full potential. At the very beginning, I mentioned that it's so great to be in a room full of people, to see as many familiar faces as we have over the years at CEDA. After a bit of a prolonged COVID-induced absence through the majority of 2020, we're delighted to be back here in Parramatta, and we'll be committed to ramping up engagement through 2021 with a series of roundtable virtual discussions, and of course with the continuing weakening of restrictions, fingers crossed that continues, face-to-face events. To that end, we're delighted to have recently confirmed with Treasurer Perrottet both the upcoming intergenerational report, which coincidentally the last one we released in this very room. That event will be on the 25th of May, and then the following month the post-budget address with the Treasurer. So no doubt the issues we talked about today will be further elaborated on in those 2 upcoming CEDA events. We'll be getting those events up on our website shortly, and look forward to seeing you at those. For now though, thank you for your attendance, and hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.